Hello, everybody. We've spent some time together in the meantime, and I hope you're still up for listening to, one must say, a Western take on the Bucharest Biennale, because as you were already told, I am not from Romania, even though it was in the first program. I'm from Hamburg in Germany, originally from the United States. But I went to Bucharest to the Biennale some years ago as a critic and as a teacher, because I was there with a group of art students as well, and I was very struck by the various complexities of this particular Biennale situation. I think that it fits in with the discussion we've been having, and it epitomizes, in my view, various aspects that we've been talking about. Already at first sight, Romania's vibrant yet also consistently deteriorating capital reveals its complexity, yet also its complexity as a threshold arena resonant with intense contrasts, swaying between East and West, post-communist repercussions, and the problematic dynamics of turbo-capitalism that have seized Eastern and Central European societies in the wake of the collapse of socialism. Before this backdrop, the Bucharest Biennale was initiated in 2005. That is, it's quite a young biennale, and it's not the only one, I have to say. There is another counter biennale in Bucharest, but I'm not going to go into that in detail. Just so you know, there's a lot of counter stuff going on in Bucharest. But there is the Bucharest Biennale, which was initiated in 2005 by two local art theorists and curators who also claim to have been activists, Razvan Ion, born in 1970, and Eugen Radescu, born in 1978. To date, apart from the Biennale I just mentioned, it represents the only major Biennale project, ambitious Biennale project of its kind in the region. With the Bucharest Biennale, Ion and Radescu sought to promote an awareness, and I'm quoting this here now, an awareness and dissemination of the culture, particularly in the fields of the arts, by means of exchanges and cultural cooperation within Europe and beyond. They started out with an internet platform. They started out quite small, quite exclusive, intimate, with an internet platform for photography before establishing the so-called Pavilion Journal for Politics and Culture in 2001, from which the Biennale then eventually emerged as a forum for the presentation of current art and the discussion of aesthetic, political and social issues in the face of the shifts and upheavals impacting Central Europe as such, and Bucharest in particular today. There you can see the sign which was used, the poster, which interestingly looks quite prominent, but when one was there, wasn't really so prominent in the city. Visiting the Bucharest Biennale for the first time in May 2010 for its fourth edition as a critic based in Germany, the fact that a young German curator, namely Felix Vogel, had conceived the program of the BB4 was one more reason and was something that made me curious to actually see what was going on in the heart of a region marked by radical transformations, yet still hovering on the fringes of Western art reception. The press conference was held at the high-rise Intercontinental Hotel on busy Nicolae Balescu Boulevard, featuring a brutalist facade and a plushy old world interior. Right around the corner, one of the 5 BB4 venues was tucked away in a quiet side street. This is it. You can't really see that it's a venue. It's a garage, in fact. Excuse me for a second. The Paradis Garage, at the time one of the few artist-run spaces in Bucharest, featured the 3-part film Autolith, produced by the meanwhile very successful London-based autolith group Anjalika Sagar and Kodwo Eshun. This is a scene from this film. It's a 3-part film. And they also were participants in the last document. Leaping between various realities, times, and places, the film travels from a distant future into the recent past, conjoining and subverting utopias of yesterday and political visions of tomorrow. In a way, the film was programmatic for the thematic underpinning developed by the art and media theorist Felix Vogel for the BB4, namely the young curator. This is him, very young curator. Born in 1987, and meanwhile holding a position at the University of Zurich, he was championed at the time as, quote, youngest curator of a biennale ever. I think this is very likely possible. Following in the footsteps of Eugen Radescu, who was in charge of the first edition of the Bucharest Biennale, the Hungarian critic and curator Zsolt Petranyi, who conceived the BB2 in 2006, and the Swedish curators Jan-Erik Lundström and Johan Söström, this is very Swedish to me, responsible for the BB3 in 2008. Vogel had first become acquainted with the art scene in Bucharest when visiting the Biennale there in 2006. In fact, when talking to him, he mentioned that something had driven him to go there. He was so totally curious about what was happening there because this was one place in the European world which he knew virtually nothing about. This prompted him then to visit the Bucharest Biennale in 2006, and then he became acquainted with the initiators and was asked to, in fact, curate this edition. His concept for the BB4, entitled Handlung, on producing possibilities, was based upon the notion of the vita activa derived from Hannah Arendt's treatise The Human Condition of 1958. Revolving around the conflation of action and narrative inherent in the German term Handlung, it was linked to forms of art practice that question, disrupt, and intervene in social reality. Vogel also drew upon the writings of the London-based political theorist Chantal Mouffe, in particular upon her thesis, this is her in blonde, only woman there, in particular upon her thesis of agonistic pluralism, where conflict becomes a source of creative energy and change within a democratic social framework. While a number of artistic interventions planned for the event could not be realized due to a lack of funding, the BB4 was certainly not short of conflicts. Thus, for instance, the photo montage Tit for Twat of Los Angeles-based artist Cecilia Brooke transposing the biblical story of Adam and Eve into an interracial lesbian narrative was censored by the management of the National Geology Museum, where it was supposed to have been shown because of its supposedly pornographic subject matter. This is not so easily imaginable at this point. I didn't want to shock you, so I, didn't show the whole story here with all of its pornographic subject matter. In a leaflet added to the exhibition catalog, the organizers of the Biennale expressed their, quote, regret that in a democratic country, member of the European Union, such Stalinist acts can still occur, quote, end of quote. The fact that they did not supply another venue for Brooke's work was in turn heavily criticized by a group of local and international artists in the blog Art Leaks in July 2011. Apart from the National Geology Museum, the Paradis Garage, and the independent artist-run Center for Visual Introspection, this is the title of this artist-run center, conceived to counter, quote, the restrictive institutional frameworks present within the Romanian cultural sphere, the BB4 venues included the Institute of Political Research and the Pavilion Unicredit Center for Contemporary Art and Culture. Wait a minute, yeah, this is, no, I'm too, let me think. Something got messed up. Don't worry about it. Ion and Radescu established the Pavilion Center, which has become the conceptual hub of the Biennale and recently moved location to downtown Bucharest in 2009 in former office spaces of the Unicredit Tiriac Bank. Together with Pilsner Urquell, Unicredit was originally one of the main sponsors of the Bucharest Biennale, a commercial tie that was also, as you can see, sharply rejected and criticized by the artists in the blog mentioned who renamed the center Pavilion Discredit. Now, I had a picture of what it looks like. This is what it looks like, exactly. This is the former location of the Pavilion Unicredit, where apart from the Biennale, a lot of exhibitions and lectures and other activities take place, so it's become a kind of a hub also for Bucharest contemporary art presentation and discussion. Despite the fact that Vogel had invited prolific protagonists of contemporary art, along with young, emerging and lesser-known art producers, the press conference of the BB4, which is here, which looks pretty well filled, though well attended, was more or less devoid of the usual suspects who can otherwise be observed flocking to each and every Biennale event. You see, I am a little bit self-critical of the, the profession of being a critic in today's art world. Most critics present were from the larger region of Romania and adjoining countries extending towards the west to Austria. Still, together with a few other journals of art, architecture and philosophy, Vienna-based Springerin, and also the London-based magazine After All, which is affiliated to Central St. Martin's College of Art and Design, were engaged as media partners of the Biennale. Let's see here. Although, as said, the curator himself was from Germany, a choice with which the Biennale organizers had certainly hoped to stimulate the interest of Western media representatives, Hamburg-based Art magazine was one of the few prominent media in Germany to carry a larger piece on the exhibition, with a special focus on the cultural situation of Bucharest as a whole. Taking 1989 as, quote, the starting point of a new era, art author Alain Biba came to the jubilant conclusion in June 2010 that, quote, contemporary Romanian art has not yet come of age. It is still in its puberty, is defiant and wild, untamed, and keen on experimenting. A whiff of revolution is in the air, end of quote. In fact, all in all, the BB4 was a rather quiet and compact affair. Vogel had assembled about 40 predominantly European artists, ranging from the prolific experimental German filmmaker Alexander Kluge to New York-based German Documenta 12 participant Andrea Geier, who restaged the Eichmann trial in her disturbing multi-channel video installation Criminal Case 4061 Reverb of 2009, relating to Hannah Arendt's report on the banality of evil. Most participants of the BB4, such as the Basque artist Asier Mendizabal, which is here, who investigates the meaning of social-political science constructions and monuments in his work, or the Dutch artist Nicolien van Haaskamp, who analyzes the role of spoken words as instruments of power, are acutely engaged in exploring political issues. Surprisingly few artists from Romania were present in this Biennale edition, one of these being the major conceptual artist, Ion Grigorescu, kind of an art historical position almost, Ion Grigorescu, who's secretly produced photo documentation, electoral meeting from 1975 reveals the oppressiveness of the Ceausescu regime. But then, Vogel didn't have the intention to put together an exhibition that showcased a specific national adherence or context. His objective was rather to expand the boundaries of perception towards a more free-floating art practice carried out by protagonists who do not necessarily define themselves in terms of their particular nationalities, but instead through a shared interest in broader themes that are impacting contemporary societies in today's globalized times per se. In an interview with Markus Miesen from 2008, republished in excerpts on the webpage of the BB4, Vogel aptly elucidated why he does not believe in reading Europe in terms of a, quote, traditional roadmap or even a spatial definition of, quote, territorial construction, stating, quote, if you have just this roadmap atlas perception and you are only changing it according to changes on this particular map, you are just reproducing today's political discourses. I would rather continue to differ from this and produce personal as opposed to spatial and political border-related maps, which could have the possibility to overcome these strict and more or less random atlases, end of quote. From the very beginning, the initiators of the Bucharest Biennale hoped to trigger a dialogue between periphery and center, East and West, non-established and established art production, and thus expressly invited international curators from outside of Romania as curators to lend the Biennale international scope and visibility. Yet even after 5 increasingly ambitious Biennale editions, the most recent BB5 having been conceived by the New York-based Scottish curator Anne Barlow, and the BB6 scheduled to open in May 2014 under the auspices of the renowned curator and director of the Kunsthalle Wien, Nikolaus Schaafhausen, Bucharest and Romania as such are still largely perceived as white spots on the map of the so-called art world, with the exception of a few global players such as Dan Pajovsky, who had made it onto the master plan of the Western art market, or giants of art history such as Konstantin Bakuji. With his just a second here, this is the famous endless column. With his BB6 project, Schaafhausen, born in 1965 in Düsseldorf, is planning to span a bridge between the Bucharest Biennale and the Kunsthalle Wien, yet another attempt to create new lines of understanding between Eastern and Western Europe. His Biennale concept, entitled Belonging and Longing, revolves around questions of identity and desire in a time in which former notions of the nation-state have dissolved and the growing, quote, dichotomy between the other and the self becomes a trigger for seeking a place of identity in the elsewhere. In contrast to former Bucharest Biennale editions, Schaafhausen is not placing a focus upon international art. Instead, he intends to exclusively present artists from Romania working either in their home environment or abroad who have disappeared into the black holes of art perception, both in the contexts of the Western art market and those of their native country. A particular focus will lie on the, quote, continued migration of young artists, we heard about this already today, who are leaving their countries due to a lack of infrastructure and financial means. This we also already saw. This is the Irwin kind of a roadmap, yes. Schaafhausen is very much aware of the global art market's tendency of exoticizing the local art practice of countries outside of the Western art circuit. However, these problematic identity politics will work both ways, recalling what the Serbian critic, curator, and director of the Center for Visual Culture at the Museum for Contemporary Art in Belgrade, Branislav Dimitrijevic, has outlined with regard to the retro avant-garde concepts of the very same urban group as part of the collective Neue Slowenische Kunst, and the, quote, operational myth of Eastern Europe as such, which, he claims, quote, is based upon marginality, dissidence, tactical cynicism, samizdat activities, and end of quote. As Dimitrijevic further elaborates, quote, hence visibility and accomplishments cause cracks that are difficult to interiorize by the very artists capitalizing on this myth and the art historical narrative it might generate, end of quote. The dialectics between visibility on the one hand and obscurity on the other go hand in hand with the problematic duality of the cultivation and exploitation of the exotic through the art market and the self-marginalization of artists who, out of antagonism towards or exclusion by those very mechanisms that might serve to make them more visible, enhance the artificial constructs standing in the way of new modes of perception. Meanwhile, with Romania among the poorest countries in the European Union, it shifts a little bit whether or not it's the poorest or one of the poorest. In any case, it's quite poor. The Bucharest Biennale has a massive funding problem. In addition, there is no governmental support whatsoever, making the Biennale extremely difficult to maintain as a transnational forum of aesthetic practice and discussion. Schaffhausen is working hard at the moment to ensure that the BB6 can even take place in 2014, including a conference dedicated to such topics as the impact of the financial crisis on the cultural life of the region, today's status of artists as contemporary migrant workers, the dichotomy of national identity versus the global art market, and the question of whether a localized concept of home is a vital prerequisite for artistic work to evolve in the first place. Konstantin Bancuziu, after having received international acclaim in the 1930s in Paris, was only officially acknowledged in his home country in the 1990s, is to be a pivotal figure of the conference. Dan Pajovsky, with his social-political cartoon-like drawings, this is one here, and Lia Pajovsky, who founded the Contemporary Art Archive in Bucharest together with her husband and continues to work with a wide range of methods and media of processing knowledge, are among the small circle of Romanian artists who have maintained their position as critical agents in the local context of Bucharest while being perceived far beyond the limits of their native environment. This here is Lia Pajovsky. Interestingly enough, recently both Dan Pajovsky and Lia Pajovsky had a retrospective which was staged in my birth town of Duke, North Carolina, which I found quite amazing, quite strange chance encounter. Eastern and Central Europe are in the midst of highly charged creative processes and strong shifts. Slowly, the boundaries of art reception that are still to a certain degree delineated by the historical Iron Curtain paradigms of East and West are shifting as well. These processes not only impact the art production, but also the theoretical debates alive in the region, which have an acuity that is missing in the still, despite the financial crises beginning to strike these as well, relatively saturated societies of the West. The challenge is to put the white spots of art production back or onto the map in the first place of art perception, with allowing these to be usurped by the global art market. The self-contained Western centers might benefit from the vast transformations, probing reflection and questioning of reality that the Eastern peripheries, so-called peripheries, are deeply engaged in, including the initiatives that are being taken here to pull down the very barriers that still define the Western perspective on current art. These initiatives, and notably among them the Bucharest Biennale, are all the more striking for their perseverance in view of the severe financial and other difficulties and internal fights as well. One has to also, incorporate that aspect, but which continue to encumber them. Ultimately, though, the self-rejuvenating energy that they generate, these initiatives, as is one of these, the Bucharest Biennale, is a highly potent force for extending the networks of understanding and for bringing forth new, wide-open mental landscapes that transcend, or perhaps may transcend, the old demarcations of awareness. And in this sense, possibly we can start learning from Bucharest. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay. Please, microphone możemy tam dać? We have a first question or comment.
Thank you. I found that fascinating. I reviewed the BBB5, Tactics for the Here and Now. It was the most curious exhibition I've ever experienced. And I have to say, it's the only exhibition I reviewed for the Huffington Post, and they refused to publish it. Oh. It was so transparent of what is done in the art world. And do you know, I had no idea how, like Ann Barlow did it, who's a New York curator, how intentional it was to be so self-exposed, I mean, with that title. I'm still mystified. But I'm glad to know they learned their lesson and now are looking inward. The only thing I liked was a black hole. It was in the basement. The room was completely black, lit by candles. So dangerous. And it was a Romanian artist. And it was audio about her experience under the dictatorship when there was like no food. And it was the most incredibly powerful piece. And you know, it was like the only one that really had any resonance. You know?
But did you experience inner conflicts as well? I mean, which is really a problem. Also in Bucharest, there was a lot of inner turmoil between the local art scene and the
But see, I didn't know any of that. I went to, I actually went as a tourist, you know. I didn't know anybody. I didn't go to the, any of the opening stuff. I knew nothing. Yeah, I just said, I'm here, and then, And that's what's interesting too, how much when you have a press preview and you try to court press and you give them like your interpretation of events, how much that affects what we write. The fact that I just walked in and didn't really know what to make of it. And I made a reference in the review of how much it does show how much the inner working and how much you put in this show is helping you get your next show, which was really transparent in some of the works, but I didn't know if that was ironic or, And then I said, yeah. And then I had a comment of a friend I made there, Romanian. He said, yeah, sort of like the old socialist government. So anyway, an art blog published it. He said it was the most curious review he's published. And then it became a big source of conversation in my Facebook. So I don't know. It's just really curious how, they're learning this process through their Biennale of how to,
Well, I think the dynamics there is interesting because it involves both getting people from the West to acknowledge that something's happening there, and having Western curators, obviously for clear reasons, namely to draw in the Western gaze or whatever you want to say.
She must have chosen that topic?
Yeah, definitely.
See, I wouldn't have known.
Yes, absolutely. No, they're completely free, the curators, to do that, absolutely. And so it's like always this kind of dynamics, dialectic dynamics of inner and outer views and reflections and so on.
So maybe Ann Barlow, being as clever as I know she is, I mean, that's how I ended up writing the review, that she knew what she was doing, and on a very ironic level we're not even used to, how she made that opportunity, in other words, she like entered the black hole of Bucharest, not knowing who would be there to interpret it, especially with the history you give of the earlier biennales didn't really attract the international press, so, maybe a certain freedom for her to say what goes on in the art world, so it was really interesting.
Is anybody here from Romania? I don't think so. Is there anybody? No? This would have been interesting for me personally, just to hear the inside story, basically from another point of view. Questions? Anybody? Still?